Hello people, this is one of my spontaneous videos, so if it's not that well constructed, my apologies, but I honestly just feel like making it on the spot, partly in response to something I've just seen. I've just watched a video and I often quote depressing videos. This one was actually uplifting. It was a nice video. It was called China, Japan, Korea Youth Friendship Meeting. It's a few years old now, from 2009, but I just want to commend the organisers of that event. I'm not sure where it was held, I don't know all the details, but I'll put a link in this video to that, and it is nice to see that, especially in a part of the world where, in my view, neo-nationalism runs very deep. I believe someone wrote underneath, please invite Indonesia and Vietnam next time, and I would agree with that. It would be nice to see it even broaden out. Obviously there's a long history of tensions between Korea and China and Japan, specifically Korea and China and Japan, and it's good that someone has taken the initiative to organise an event about inspiring young people to think differently. There's been similar objectives in other parts of the world, similar in Europe between French and German youths, and on a smaller scale there's been schemes, for example in Northern Ireland and in Glasgow, to bridge the sectarian divides in those parts of the UK between youths, because I think the focus on young people is that they are the future generation. This poses a lot of sort of interesting questions. Firstly, some people are sort of get reactionary to this and think, oh, they're going to forget what, for example, Imperial Japan done or whatever. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's just a case of trying to neutralise neo-nationalism. I don't think it's a case of whitewashing history. Because from my perspective, I'm focusing on East Asia region specifically, because that is a part of the world I do think that neo-nationalism is very, very rife. And I'm not taking sides here, I'm just pointing out that it is obvious across that part of the world. You could see it in a lot of those countries. I mean, recently, if you look at the very sort of extreme nationalist backlash in Vietnam against Chinese companies over the dispute that China has with Vietnam over some fishing territory and islands and so on. Now, I really don't know enough about the subject to say who's right and who's wrong, but that's just an example, and sadly there were a number of people killed in those protests. China, of course, had to tell its citizens to be very cautious and pull out. Vietnam said they would crack down on the rioters, but the irony of this is both countries that have a long history of censorship. They're both communist countries, and both countries are known for censoring the internet, so they're sort of attacking each other, but I think they need to be looking into what their governments are actually hiding from themselves. And that's not a case of saying there aren't legitimate concerns about the other side, and like I said, I'm not going to take sides, but what I find is this neo-nationalism is often in tandem with governments that hide their own information. Now, this week, and I'll focus more about this in another video, we're coming up to the 25th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square crackdown in China. The tragedy is a lot of young Chinese are either unaware of that event or it's really fading from memory. And this is not like, we're not talking about hundreds of years ago, this is well within living memory. So I just find it tragic that the young people who died that day, and it wasn't just students, there was many civilians killed, their sacrifice is basically being forgotten because of this massive censorship campaign by the CCP. Now, I don't want to go into details with that because it's sort of that for another video. What I wanted to talk about in this video is nationalism, basically. It can be seen all over the world. It's not something that's unique to the East Asian region. It can be seen everywhere, absolutely everywhere, albeit at varying levels, but it can be seen everywhere. I personally like to make a difference between patriotism and nationalism. What I mean by that is a patriot will care deeply about his or her country, but they'll not be so blinded by jingoism, i.e. hostility to outsiders, that they cannot recognise moral flaws that either their country has been guilty of, or problems within their country. Because from my perspective, neo-nationalists are so brainwashed by their mindset that they just can't comprehend that their government may actually be enacting policies that are wrong. Um, and like I say, it can be seen everywhere. It's not a phenomenon in any particular country. In Europe, you do see far-right movements that are very vocal. They're not as powerful as the media sometimes imply that they are. Um, and you see it all over the world. You've seen it with Chinese neo-nationalists at the time of the Beijing Olympics. That made me very uncomfortable, and I think it made a lot of outsiders very uncomfortable, because it looked incredibly arrogant, and it did. Well, I don't want to focus on China, because then people will think, oh, why are you just focusing on China? I'm just citing that as an example because China is a growing superpower. But the same can be seen in India, it can be seen everywhere. And I just think it's a very sad way of thinking. Look, I won't lie, there's times I feel quite reactionary, and if someone is attacking my country in something in a way that I think is unfair, I will be reactionary, and I will say that's simply not the case, etc., etc. But I do try to be objective, and I do try to always counter any defensive rhetoric I would have with an acknowledgement of problems. And I think open-minded people need to try and do that. What I'm saying is people need to get beyond this sort of thing of only thinking through national mentality. A Chinese friend of mine recently, a lady I know here, maybe this is what's got me thinking about this, she said that in Britain people don't seem to be as sort of supportive of national events as they would be in China. What she was talking about is our participation in the Eurovision Song Contest. She said if China was involved in an international event, everyone would be really ultra enthusiastic. I'm not sure if that's entirely true, with all due respect to my friend, but I do think she's right in one respect, that Chinese people probably are more nationally enthusiastic overall. It's not a universal situation, but I think that China is at a stage in its history whereby people are a little bit blinded by neo-nationalism. I've been in so many debates where I've tried to get through to people and point out some very obvious problems that the rest of the world can see, and they've just responded with things like, oh, you don't understand Chinese culture, the government has to do this to create stability, and basically they just make excuses for some things that really, really can't be excused. And I do find that a little bit frustrating. So for me, there's definitely an undercurrent of neo-nationalism that can be found in rising powers. China is a prominent example, but it can be seen in other rising powers as well, such as India, probably all the BRIC countries on some level. And that's not to say that countries that are already considered to be great powers in terms of geopolitics don't have arrogant nationalism as well. I've certainly seen it plenty of times in Britain. I mean, to give an example, British people complain about immigration, some British people, and then we are huge immigrants in Spain. So by that same token, the Spanish people would have a right to complain about us. So I think wherever there's this nationalist mentality, people need to really try and be more open-minded, and I think it's as old as time for people to have this tribal, national mindset. I think that's as old as time. I don't think it's ever going to go. So long as we have boundaries in this world. What was it John Lennon said? Imagine there's no countries. Well, that is just imagination, because there always will be. And so long as there is international boundaries, people will ultimately have a tribal mindset. And I'm not talking about rabid neo-nationalists who hate foreigners. I'm talking about pretty normal people. I think most people, if they're honest, have at some point in their life had a defensive mentality if they've heard someone else criticizing their country. And that doesn't mean they're racists, it doesn't mean that they're extremists. I just think that people need to be wary that this can go to extremes. So there is a fine line between a level-headed defense of one's country and just being extreme and being far too sensitive and far too reactionary. What we need to remember is this is an interconnected world. Now, one of the problems with a lot of Asian countries is they don't have the same sort of freedom of expression and conscience as Western countries do. And that's not sort of saying, oh, we're better than them. It's just a fact. The sheer depth of internet censorship and control in a lot of countries in that part of the world is very strong. With that comes a sort of promotion of neo-nationalism, and you see it all the time, like people saying, oh, it's biased Western media, oh, it's foreigners conspiring against us, this sort of thing. And it's unfortunate that people can't be a little bit more objective and sort of think, well, some of this might well be true, we are having this problem. You know, there's problems in Britain, and if people from other countries pointed those problems out, I would like to think I'm open-minded enough to say, yeah, you're absolutely right, and we need to do something about this. So I associate nationalism with a tribalist mindset, and it's unfortunate. Although there are two different types of nationalism, there's another type of nationalism which is a lot more understandable. That's seeking statehood. That is disputed areas who want self-determination, and they go through often bloody struggles to get that. That is also a form of nationalism, but to me that is not the same as blood and soil nationalism, because we're not talking about countries that already exist. We're talking about people who are desperately seeking statehood. Obvious examples would be Palestinians, Kurds. That's a form of nationalism, but I do think it's different. And that's not to say that I take sides in those conflicts, but I just don't associate that with, for example, rabid football hooligans in a European country talking about blood and soil ethnicity, or hysterical students in some Asian countries burning their neighbouring country's flags, that sort of thing. So you do get different types of nationalism. That's just my thoughts on the matter, and what I would just like to say is, I'm British. I care deeply about my country. I care about my country. I think this is a pretty good country to live in overall. And I will speak up for my country if I think there's unfair criticism levelled against it. On the other hand, I am not so obnoxious, not so brainwashed as to always say, oh yeah, we're right, you're wrong. I try to be objective. I try to sort of look at where the criticism is coming from, and at times it is justified. So I try to... The last thing I want to be is a blind neo-nationalist. With Western countries, maybe we are more used to diversity. So where you do get nationalism in Western countries, it tends to be marginalised. It tends to be more from extremist political parties. Whereas I find in other parts of the world it's a lot more mainstream. And that might sound like a radical statement, but it's just my perspective. Because where you get neo-nationalism in Western countries, it is controversial. Whereas in a country like China, it's considered to be normal. So that is a difference. Let me know your thoughts on this. Let me know which country you're from. That would be an interesting thing. Please, if you're watching this video, let me know what country you're from, anywhere in the world, and let me know what is the situation in your country. Do you think people in your country have a healthy balance? Do you think they're objective? Speaking for my fellow Britons, I would say it's hard to tell. Overall, I would say we're not too extreme, but there are pockets of people who are very blinded, and they are very arrogant and stubborn, and they can't see some of the problems that we have. And they do come out with things that are utterly hypocritical. So I can see our international friends being frustrated by that. So let me know, if you're watching this video, what part of the world are you from, and in your country have you noticed this? I'd like, if possible, an East-West response. I don't want just Western people to respond. I'd like people from the East to respond as well, and please let me know how you feel about the situation in your own country. Thank you.